All right, parents, Dr. Andrew here, and I want to explain what proprioceptive or sensory processing disorders look like. We're going to come back to my earmuffs and my speaker and my explanation that I've got here for you. But let's start with just a little bit of a foundational understanding of what we are talking about. Because proprioception, this big fancy word, might not be one that you've heard before, but it is at the root of so much that's going on in your life, and it's connected to so many other neurodevelopmental challenges in kids, whether it's ADHD or anxiety or autism, sensory processing disorder. So if that is something that you are trying to get answers and find help for, this video is for you. So proprioception is the sixth sense. You might hear people refer to it as that. It is your body's self-awareness. It's the ability to take in your body when you're not necessarily aware of it in any other way. Like we can close our eyes and touch our elbow, or we know if we're leaning to one side or if we're tilted. This is a huge priority for your brain. It's one of the things that makes us able to stand on 2 feet and walk as humans do. So proprioception is a big piece of development. It starts super young. All of our digestion and more cognitive emotional development starts with movement stimulation. And the reason for that is because movement feeds the brain, especially as a baby. Crawling, rolling, picking their head up, engaging in the world, all of that movement is what stimulates the brain, and that brain stimulation is what drives the next layer of development. So absolutely crucial, absolutely foundational, and super likely to get twisted, to get thrown off. All of the proprioceptive info that we get in our body, which comes from everywhere. It comes from our skin, it comes from our joints, it comes from all over. The majority of it is centered around our spine, our core. The majority of the body's sensory input comes from there. And if we hone in even more, the majority of the info in the spine comes from this small region up top. This upper cervical region, the top of the neck. It is so important for the brain to be able to keep our eyes level with the horizon. It's where a lot of our vestibular or balance centers are. So there is so much rich proprioceptive sensory input in this region that it blows everything else out of the water. So how does that connect to these challenges? We see kids specifically with stress and dysfunction in this upper neck, typically due to birth process, typically connected to maybe a traumatic birth, forceps vacuum, pulling, C-section, some sort of birth stress or early F challenge in kids affects that input, which means that now that brain feeding, that brain nutrition, we could call it, is thrown off. They don't get that good stimulation. So instead of nice, calming environments and good brain food, it's like their brain is constantly perceiving stress. It's like we had a speaker, way bigger than this, blaring hard rock, metal, obnoxious. Well, I guess that's not really a fair comparison because a lot of people like hard rock, metal, obnoxious music, but something, we'll call it static. We'll call it some sort of disturbing noise instead of elevator music, instead of calm silence. If you had that constant static blaring in your brain at all times, you wouldn't have a chance to focus, wouldn't have a chance to do well at school, or you'd feel on edge, you'd feel stressed. That's why you see some people cope with it by trying to mute it, right? I can't even hear myself now because these do such a great job of muting sensory input. So some kids need that. They have to hide from the external stimulations. Certain clothing textures bother them. Certain environments are challenging. And that is helpful in a way because we don't want to stress our kids out more than they need to be. But the better option is to turn down the noise. And that's what the adjustment does. The adjustment corrects that stress internally so that we don't have the stress going to the brain. So we don't have the bombardment in the wild sensory input. And we see so many cool stories come from that. Just this morning, one of the little girls getting adjusted, she, has had major sensory issues. It wasn't really communicating before coming to the office. It showed up in many ways in her life. And she, for the first time, completely independently, laid on the table by herself, laid on her back, which was a huge trigger. She couldn't even lean backwards in mom's arms because it was throwing off her sense of space and sense of sensory input. And she did amazing by herself today. So the sensory input is the root of so many of these other things because we can't focus when that sensory input is jumbled. We can't relax when our brain is constantly under fire and under SOS. So we can calm all those other things down by fixing the sensory input, by fixing that central core stress in the nervous system. So check out some of the blogs we have. Check out the webinar tomorrow night with Dr. Tony to learn more, to dig more into the science, and reach out if that makes sense and you want to get your kid on that path to healing.